Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Skull and Hats Tales. I'm always curious to know where the people who watch this channel are from. So before you relax, consider leaving a comment. Now, let's get started. I had been hesitant about online dating, but something about her profile stood out. Her name was Claire, and her pictures had an effortless charm, natural smiles, a love for the outdoors, and a passion for reading. Her bio was simple: looking for someone to share adventures and good books with. Let's start with a coffee and see where it goes. We'd messaged a few times before agreeing to meet at a cozy cafe downtown. The place was small, with low lighting and a quiet, relaxed atmosphere, exactly what I had hoped for on a first date. When I arrived, I was early, but I didn't mind. It gave me a moment to take in the ambiance, to breathe before things began. When Claire walked in, I instantly recognized her from her photos. She wore a light blue sweater and jeans, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. She smiled when she saw me, and I felt a little tension ease from my shoulders. "Hey, it's nice to finally meet you," she said, sitting down across from me. I returned her smile. "Yeah, it's great to meet you too." We dove right into conversation, as though we had known each other for ages. The usual first date small talk followed: what we did for work, where we were from, hobbies and interests. I was surprised at how easily the words came. Claire was funny, easygoing, and refreshingly down to earth. She spoke with genuine enthusiasm about her love for hiking and reading, two things I also enjoyed, and the connection felt immediate. The conversation flowed smoothly, and I couldn't help but relax. This was the kind of date I'd always hoped for: pleasant, natural, and full of potential. As the minutes turned into hours, the conversation continued to flow effortlessly. Claire and I laughed about a shared love for cheesy 80s movies and compared our travel experiences. She told me about her trips to Europe, and I found myself telling her about my time in Japan. We seemed to be checking off all the boxes: shared interests, mutual respect, and a sense of humor that clicked. I felt an unexpected ease, as though we were two old friends catching up, rather than two strangers on a first date. It was refreshing. We discussed books. Claire was an avid reader, and I mentioned a few of my favorites, which seemed to pique her interest. She leaned forward, eager to know more. The energy between us was light, comfortable, and most importantly, normal. "I've always wanted to try hiking in the mountains," she said, her smile softening. "You ever do something like that?" "Yeah, a few times. There's this great trail about an hour outside of the city. I can show you sometime if you're interested." Her eyes lit up. "I'd love that. I'm always looking for new places to explore." At that moment, I felt the unmistakable spark of connection, the kind you don't get very often on first dates. There was something about her, her openness, her warmth, that made me feel instantly comfortable, like I could be myself without any pretenses. It seemed like the night was going perfectly, but as the evening wore on, I began to notice things that didn't quite add up. It was subtle at first, small, odd moments that made my instincts itch. I chalked them up to my own nervousness. After all, first dates can be awkward, right? It started with the people at the tables around us. I noticed a man in a corner booth staring at us a little too intently, his gaze lingering just a moment too long. I looked away quickly, trying to dismiss it as my imagination. But then there was another person, this time a woman, sitting at the bar, who seemed to glance over every time I caught her eye. Claire didn't seem to notice, or if she did, she didn't acknowledge it. She was talking about her latest read, some thriller novel, and I was trying to focus on the conversation, but my attention kept drifting back to the strange looks from the nearby tables. It wasn't overt, just too constant. I shook it off, telling myself I was just overthinking things. The cafe wasn't exactly bustling, and people do look around, right? But the feeling in my chest didn't fade. Then, as Claire was explaining the plot of the book, I noticed something else. Her eyes had changed. Where they had been soft and warm, they now seemed sharper, more calculating, though she still maintained her smile. Her voice dropped lower, the words more measured. "You ever feel like you're being watched? Like something's not right, but you can't put your finger on it?" I froze for a moment. The words felt odd, out of place. But before I could respond, Claire smiled again and continued on as if nothing had happened. I nodded, uneasy, forcing myself to stay present. The unease lingered, but I told myself it was just nerves, maybe even a coincidence. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that something had shifted, that something was wrong. The next few minutes only deepened my sense of discomfort. Claire's tone was different now, her smile too calculated, her laughter too forced. She kept leaning in a little too close, asking increasingly personal questions about my family, my vulnerabilities, and my past relationships. I wasn't opposed to talking about myself, but the way she framed the questions felt oddly probing. And then it happened. A subtle shift in the room. The group at the table next to us had moved. The man who had been staring earlier was now standing near the entrance, glancing toward us every few seconds. The woman at the bar was gone, but in her place was a man with a strong, intense gaze, watching from the other side of the room. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was no reason for these people to be looking at us like this. It wasn't normal. And I could feel Claire's eyes never leaving mine, her smile just a bit too wide, her words falling into an unsettling rhythm. "What if I told you I could change everything for you?" she said suddenly, her voice a whisper now. "What if I told you that you could have everything you've ever wanted, if you just trust me?" I stared at her, confusion and fear swirling in my chest. This wasn't the date I had signed up for. I felt trapped, as if the walls were closing in. My mind raced, my body frozen. Something was happening here, something I didn't understand. But it was becoming clear that I was no longer just on a date. I glanced quickly around the room. The people nearby, there were more now, were subtly surrounding us. Their eyes, their stance, everything about them felt calculated, deliberate. This wasn't random. They were part of something, and I was the target. I stood frozen, the weight of the situation sinking in. Claire's demeanor had shifted completely, no longer warm and inviting, but cold, calculating. Her smile felt too sharp now, and the air around us had thickened with a strange tension. The people surrounding us weren't just onlookers, they were part of something. I realized, with a sickening clarity, that I had walked into a trap. "Claire, what's going on?" My voice was unsteady, but I couldn't hide the panic creeping in. Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes hardened. "You're more observant than I thought," she said, her voice still low, but now laced with something darker. "I've been waiting for you." Before I could respond, the man who had been standing by the door stepped forward. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his presence almost suffocating. Another figure, a woman, one I hadn't noticed before, joined him. The group around us was no longer casual diners. They were closing in. "What is this?" I demanded, my heart racing as my hands clenched into fists. "What do you want from me?" Claire leaned forward, her voice barely a whisper now. "It's not about what we want from you. It's about what you're going to do for us. We've been watching you for a long time. You're exactly what we need." The words hit me like a blow. My mind spun, trying to make sense of what she was saying. I hadn't noticed anything unusual before. This was supposed to be a normal date, but now it felt like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. "I don't understand," I said, struggling to stay calm. "What is this? Who are you?" The man by the door smirked, his eyes glinting with malice. "You're part of the plan now. It's too late to walk away." A cold wave of realization washed over me. This wasn't some bizarre misunderstanding or a strange coincidence. I was being lured into something far darker, something they had planned. My pulse raced as I looked around for an escape. The cafe was no longer just a casual setting, it had become a cage. The doors were blocked, and the people who had once been innocuous customers were now closing in, their expressions blank, as if they were waiting for something to happen. Claire's eyes bored into mine, and the man who had been standing by the door took another step forward, cutting off the exit. "You don't have to make this harder," Claire said, her voice surprisingly calm. "You can still be a part of something bigger, something important. All you need to do is accept." I took a step back, my mind racing. There had to be a way out. I couldn't let them control the situation. I forced myself to stay calm, to think. The back exit, it was a long shot, but it was my only chance. Without warning, I turned on my heel and bolted. "Hey!" Claire shouted, but it was too late. I ran toward the back of the cafe, my heart pounding in my chest. I heard the footsteps behind me, but I didn't look back. My only thought was to escape. I reached the kitchen door, my fingers fumbling with the handle. It opened just enough for me to slip through. I didn't wait to see if they followed. I ran down a narrow alley that ran behind the cafe, barely noticing my surroundings as I fled. It was an ordinary morning when I noticed that my dog, Max, wasn't at his usual spot by the door, tail wagging in anticipation of breakfast. At first, I thought he was just sleeping in, something he did occasionally when he was exhausted after a long walk the day before. But as the minutes passed and he didn't show up, my unease began to grow. I walked through the house, calling his name softly. "Max," I said, my voice growing more insistent. I checked his bed, the couch, under the kitchen table, but there was no sign of him. I checked the backyard, shaking the dog treats box, but there was nothing. No Max. No barking, no excited paws at the door. I called out again, hoping to hear that familiar shuffle of paws against the floor, but only the silence greeted me. I walked to the door and checked the yard once more, but it was empty. My heart began to beat a little faster, a knot tightening in my stomach. Max was always in the yard when he wasn't with me. There was no way he could have gotten out unless someone had taken him. I grabbed my phone and called a few neighbors, asking if they had seen him wandering around. None of them had. I went down the street, knocking on doors, checking bushes, and asking anyone who might have seen anything. It didn't make sense. Max was a dog who loved to stay close to home, never venturing far. He had to be nearby. But as the hours went on, my worry turned to confusion. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Max had never just vanished like this before. As the evening wore on, my frustration mounted. It felt like I was getting nowhere. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the empty street. And that was when I saw it, a shadowy figure in a long coat walking briskly near the edge of the neighborhood. I didn't think much of it at first. People walk in and out of our neighborhood all the time. But as I continued to walk, trying to find Max, I noticed the figure again, this time standing still, just outside the row of houses. He seemed to be watching the street, his eyes shifting from house to house. It was too dark for me to make out his face, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he had been paying attention to me as I passed. A chill ran down my spine, but I pushed the feeling aside. Maybe it was nothing. Still, as I kept walking, I couldn't stop glancing back. The man was still standing there, unmoving, watching. It wasn't until I reached the end of the block and turned the corner that I heard a sound, a faint rustle, like footsteps, quickly retreating into the alley behind a nearby house. I stood still for a moment, straining to hear, but the neighborhood was eerily quiet again. Still, that nagging sense of unease wouldn't leave me. It felt like I had just been a part of something that wasn't right, but I couldn't quite piece it together yet. Over the next few days, the search for Max intensified. I put up flyers around the neighborhood, hoping someone would spot him. I knocked on more doors, talked to more people, but no one had seen him. I stopped by the local grocery store and asked the cashier if she had heard anything about missing pets. She hesitated for a moment before replying. There's been some talk about animals going missing around here recently. Not just dogs, but cats too. People say it's been happening for months, but it's all whispers. Nothing anyone wants to talk about openly. My heart sank. Missing pets? Was this some kind of pattern? I began asking around more, talking to people I didn't usually speak to. Most of them seemed hesitant to talk, but one man, George, who lived 2 blocks over, told me something that made my stomach churn. Last week I saw a van, real nondescript, nothing special, but it was parked in front of the park at night. I didn't think much of it at first, but I saw it again, parked in the same spot 2 days later. And when I looked closer, there were some cages in the back. Couldn't see what was inside, but I could hear some noise. Animals. I don't know what's going on, but it ain't good. I felt a cold shiver run through me. A van? Cages? I suddenly realized that I wasn't just dealing with a missing pet. This felt like something bigger, something darker. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Max had to be somewhere, but where? I spent the next several days combing the neighborhood, keeping my eyes peeled for anything that might look out of place. One afternoon, while walking through the park, I spotted something odd. a man standing near the edge of the woods, holding a leash, with no dog in sight. I wasn't sure why it caught my attention, but it did. There was something about his posture, the way he seemed to be scanning the area with careful, calculating movements. He looked up and caught my eye, and I quickly looked away, feeling my heart race. As I walked past him, I overheard a snippet of his conversation on the phone. "Yeah, we got another one. All set for pickup. I'll meet you at the usual spot." He turned and walked away, heading deeper into the park. I tried to ignore the feeling that was growing inside me, but I knew, whatever was going on, I was closer to finding out the truth. That night, I decided to follow him. I waited until he was out of sight, then I quietly followed at a distance, making sure to stay hidden. He led me to an old warehouse on the edge of town. I watched from behind a bush as he entered through a back door. I could see a van parked near the entrance. I wasn't sure what I expected, but when I saw the man return with a small, frightened dog in his arms, my heart stopped. I had to stop this. I had to find Max. The sight of the dog in the man's arms was a sickening confirmation of my worst fears. I wasn't dealing with some random thief or a series of isolated incidents. This was an operation. They were taking animals, possibly from all over the neighborhood, and I had no idea what they were planning to do with them. I crouched low, watching from the shadows. The man disappeared into the warehouse, leaving the van parked by the back entrance. My heart raced, the urgency building in my chest. I had to find out what was happening inside, and I had to do it before it was too late for Max. I waited for a moment when the area was clear, and then moved swiftly toward the van. My palms were sweaty, and I tried to ignore the pounding of my heart in my ears. I had no plan, no backup, just a desperate need to save my pet and put an end to whatever was happening in that warehouse. I checked the van's doors, locked, of course. But then I noticed something. One of the windows was cracked open just enough to slip a hand through. I pushed it open slowly, cautiously, and peeked inside. The cages were stacked neatly in the back. Some were empty, but others were filled with frightened animals, cats, small dogs, rabbits. I couldn't breathe. I pressed my back against the van, keeping low. The sound of footsteps echoed from inside the warehouse, and I held my breath, hoping they wouldn't hear me. A few minutes passed before the man returned to the van, walking briskly with the small dog still in his arms. He placed the dog in one of the cages, locking it behind him. My stomach churned as I watched. This was real. This was a full-scale operation. I couldn't stand by any longer. I needed to act now. I waited for the man to head back into the warehouse before making my move. The adrenaline coursing through my veins pushed me forward. I darted across the yard and slipped into the open door of the warehouse, my heart pounding in my chest. The inside was dimly lit and smelled musty. I could hear muffled sounds coming from deeper within, low growls, whimpers, and the occasional bark. I crept quietly, trying not to draw attention to myself. The place was filled with rows of cages, many of them occupied by animals of all sizes. Some were pacing nervously, while others lay huddled in fear. I spotted Max. He was in the far corner of the room, shaking and cowering in a cage. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. I could feel a wave of relief wash over me as I took a step toward him. But before I could reach him, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. I froze, my heart thundering in my chest. I ducked behind a large stack of crates, trying to stay out of sight. Two men walked by, talking in low voices. They passed within feet of me, oblivious to my presence. The man who had been standing by the van was among them, his face set in a grim expression. They were discussing something about next week's shipment. I couldn't catch all the details, but I knew it was bad, very bad. Once they were gone, I took a deep breath and hurried to Max's cage. I tried the lock, but it was secured tightly. Panic surged, but I forced myself to stay calm. I had to get him out of here. I looked around, spotting a small toolbox near a workbench. I grabbed a screwdriver and carefully pried open the lock, trying not to make a sound. The seconds felt like hours, but finally the lock gave way, and the cage door swung open. "Max," I whispered, reaching out to him. He was hesitant at first, but then he came to me, licking my hand, relieved to be free. I heard the door to the warehouse creak open again. There was no time to waste. I picked Max up, cradling him in my arms, and darted for the back exit. I had been feeling overwhelmed by the clutter in my apartment. Old boxes, forgotten items, and things I no longer needed had been stacking up for months. My life was in transition, new job, new routine, and I didn't have the energy to sort through it all. So, I made a decision. I would rent a storage unit. The storage facility was on the outskirts of town, tucked away between two industrial buildings. It was the kind of place you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it, and I liked that. The facility itself was quiet, no bustling traffic, no crowds of people, just rows of metal doors, each one leading to its own private space. I rented a small unit, enough to fit the extra boxes and a few old furniture pieces that I no longer had room for. The process was straightforward. Sign a lease, get a key, and I was on my way. I had no particular attachment to the items I was storing. They were just things. But the act of clearing out my space felt like a fresh start. I spent the next few days organizing the unit, arranging things neatly and methodically, trying to make sense of the clutter. That's when I noticed it. At the back corner of the unit, behind a stack of boxes, something was off. There was a pile of belongings, bags, cardboard boxes, and various items shoved into a corner, as though someone had left them behind in a hurry. It was strange. The storage units were supposed to be private, and yet this pile didn't look like something that had just been forgotten. Curiosity gnawed at me, and before I could think better of it, I moved closer, pushing aside a few boxes. I wasn't expecting to find anything noteworthy, just some old junk someone had abandoned. But as I looked more closely, my breath caught in my throat. Among the pile were items that seemed out of place, old, worn documents, bags of something heavy, and, what made my stomach twist, a set of weapons, wrapped in cloth, clearly hidden. I backed away, my heart racing. I should have walked away right then, but something compelled me to look further. A small metal case was half buried under the pile. It was locked, but it felt heavy, as though it contained something important. I set it aside carefully, trying to suppress the growing sense of unease. What had I just found, and why had someone left it here? As I dug deeper into the pile of abandoned items, I found more strange things. Documents, files marked with cryptic symbols, and a few photographs. I flipped through them carefully, wondering if they were even real. The photos showed various people, none of them familiar, standing in front of what looked like warehouses or poorly lit alleyways. In each photo, they were holding up animals, some of which I recognized as pets from my neighborhood. That was when it hit me. These weren't just random items. These were pieces of a larger operation, something dark and criminal. I looked through the papers and saw more details, contracts, lists of animals, addresses, and names that didn't make sense. Some of the animals listed had been missing in recent weeks. My heart began to race. Was I looking at some kind of illegal animal trade? I quickly closed the documents, the weight of what I had discovered sinking in. This was no ordinary storage unit, and I was no longer just a tenant here. I had stumbled onto something dangerous, something I wasn't prepared for. My hands trembled as I set the items down. I had to get out. I had to leave. But then, I heard footsteps outside the unit. The lock clicked and the door to the storage facility creaked open. Someone was coming. I froze, my heart pounding. For a moment I considered just hiding, staying completely still, but I realized it was too late. Whoever had arrived was likely heading straight for this unit. I shoved everything back into place as quickly as I could, trying to make it look as though nothing had been disturbed. The door to my storage unit swung open, and a man stepped inside. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap that shadowed his face. For a split second, our eyes locked, and my stomach dropped. "What are you doing here?" he asked in a voice that was calm but edged with an underlying aggression. He was older, mid-40s, with rough features that made him seem less like an average guy and more like someone who didn't need to ask questions. "I was just organizing my things," I stammered, forcing a smile. I had to keep calm. I had to make him believe I wasn't a threat. He stepped closer, eyes scanning the space around me, and then he paused. His gaze lingered on the pile of items I'd uncovered. A small flicker of recognition flashed across his face, and my heart skipped a beat. He stepped forward, bending down to pick up one of the weapons I had hastily hidden. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't notice the metal case I had tried to keep out of sight. "You found something you shouldn't have," he said, his voice low and cold. His hand gripped the weapon tightly, his fingers twitching as if he were about to strike. "I didn't mean to," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I wasn't looking for anything." His eyes narrowed, and he took a slow step closer. I could see now the menacing determination in his expression. "Listen, you've got two choices," he said. "You forget you saw anything, and you walk away. Or we handle this differently." I swallowed hard. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This man wasn't someone I could reason with. His presence alone made it clear that whatever I'd uncovered was far bigger than a simple crime. I had to play along. "I'll keep quiet," I said quickly, my voice shaking. "I swear, I didn't see anything." He studied me for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Good. Then you won't mention this to anyone." He paused, then leaned in just a little too close. "If you do, well, you won't get a second chance." With that, he turned, casually gathering the items he had dropped. He left as quickly as he came, leaving me standing there, my mind racing. The relief I felt was fleeting. I hadn't escaped the danger. I had only postponed it. The next few days were a blur of nervous tension. Every sound, every knock on the door made my heart skip a beat. I kept my distance from the storage unit, hoping that what I had seen would just fade into the background of my life. I did my best to go on with my normal routine, but the knowledge of what was going on, what I had discovered, haunted me. I couldn't get the image of the photographs, the animals, out of my mind. The fear of what the man might do if he found out I had told anyone kept me up at night. I couldn't even bring myself to tell the police. The operation was too big, too dangerous. But the longer I lived with the knowledge, the more I became paranoid. I constantly checked behind me, wondering if someone was watching me. Every unfamiliar face I saw, every car that passed by seemed like a threat. The man's words echoed in my mind. "If you do, well, you won't get a second chance." I tried to pretend that nothing had happened. I threw myself into work, avoided talking to my neighbors about anything other than casual small talk, and avoided the storage facility at all costs. But the fear never fully left. The knowledge of what I had uncovered lingered like a shadow, reminding me that I couldn't escape the truth. The days began to blur into each other, my mind preoccupied with the discovery I had made in the storage unit. Every time I left the house, I felt a strange sense of unease, as though something was lurking just out of sight. I couldn't shake the image of the man's cold gaze and the cryptic warning he'd given me. I felt like I was being watched, even though I knew it was likely just my imagination running wild. I kept to myself more than usual. I avoided talking to the neighbors about anything, hoping no one would ask questions. But the whispers of the neighborhood lingered in the background, especially after the strange van had been parked down the street again. I'd seen it a few times, always parked under the shadow of an old oak tree. Its engine off, but the windows tinted too dark to see inside. The sight of it triggered a new wave of anxiety. Had I truly gotten away from the people involved in whatever operation was hidden in that storage unit? Every time I saw that van, I wondered if they were following me, waiting for the right moment to confront me again. My thoughts circled endlessly, leading me to check the locks on my doors more than once, and to constantly peer through the blinds at every car that passed by. I even began to change my routine. I took different routes to work, stayed inside after dark, and avoided any public spaces where I might encounter unfamiliar faces. But despite my precautions, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I'd occasionally spot people on the street, their faces too familiar, too intense. It was enough to make my skin crawl, but every time I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. It started with something small, something I almost dismissed as a figment of my imagination. One evening, after a long day at work, I noticed them standing outside my house. At first I thought they were just people passing by, perhaps lost or looking for directions. But as I took a closer look, I realized they were standing still, perfectly still, in the middle of the sidewalk. They weren't doing anything, no talking, no moving. Just standing there, facing my house, as if they were waiting for something. There were 3 of them, all wearing identical white masks. I couldn't make out their expressions, but the lack of any visible features made them all the more unnerving. I could feel a strange unease settle in my chest. Why were they just standing there? I watched them for a few moments through the curtains, but when I looked again, they were gone. I sighed in relief, telling myself it was nothing, maybe a group of teenagers messing around or some kind of prank. I pushed the thoughts out of my mind and tried to forget about them. But the next day, they were back. This time, there were 4 of them, and they were standing in the same spot, silent, motionless. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I wasn't sure what I had stumbled upon, but the stillness of their presence unsettled me. I kept the curtains drawn and avoided looking outside, but I couldn't ignore the nagging thought in the back of my mind. Who were they, and why were they outside my house? Over the next few days, the figures returned, but now the group had grown. The number of masked individuals continued to increase, 5 one day, 8 the next, until I was staring out the window at a growing crowd standing silently on the sidewalk in front of my house. They were always positioned in the same place, as though they were set up for some kind of ritual or performance. I tried to ignore it, but the anxiety was building inside me. It was hard to concentrate on anything else when I knew they were out there, waiting. Each time I checked, the numbers grew, 10, 12, 15. The longer I watched, the more I noticed the small details that made the situation all the more unsettling. They weren't just standing there, they were perfectly aligned, each person in the same pose, facing the same direction, and wearing the same mask. It was as if they were part of a meticulously planned gathering. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was a protest, maybe it was an art project, but the silence, the sheer motionlessness, didn't feel like any of those things. It felt deliberate, and I couldn't escape the growing sense of dread that came over me whenever I glanced outside. The worst part was how isolated I felt. I was too scared to go out, too afraid to confront them. I didn't know who to talk to. None of my neighbors seemed to mention it when I ran into them, and I began to wonder if I was the only one who noticed. Then, one evening, as I was returning from a late errand, I saw them again. This time, the crowd was even larger. Stretching down the street, their figures nearly obscured by the dark shadows of the evening. As I walked closer, a chill crept over me. They were all facing my house, waiting, watching. I rushed inside, locking the door behind me. I couldn't shake the feeling that they knew I was watching, that they were aware of my every movement. The next day, I couldn't bring myself to leave the house. The figures were still there when I woke up, standing at their usual spots, their motionless figures staring silently at my house. As the days went by, they became a constant, an eerie fixture in my life. Their presence started to feel like an unshakable weight pressing down on me, and I grew paranoid, even when I was inside my own home. I tried to figure out their pattern. They showed up at the same times every day, usually around late afternoon or early evening. There were no verbal exchanges, no visible communication between them. They simply arrived, positioned themselves along the street, and stood there, watching. The sheer lack of movement or any indication of intent made them all the more disturbing. One day, I decided to take a walk to clear my head, hoping that the fresh air might give me some perspective. As I walked down the street, I passed them. They didn't react at all. No heads turned, no eyes followed me. They simply stood there, their blank, featureless masks staring straight ahead. But as I walked past, I couldn't help but feel a prickling sensation at the back of my neck. My pace quickened, and I didn't dare to look back. When I turned the corner, I breathed a sigh of relief, but it didn't last. I felt their presence linger, as if I could still sense their eyes on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that they knew me, that they were somehow watching me every moment of the day, even when I wasn't aware of it. It was late one evening when the situation escalated. I had been trying to ignore the figures, hoping that if I pretended they weren't there, they would leave. But that night, something was different. I woke to the sound of something scratching at the door. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again, a soft scraping, followed by a sharp knock. My pulse quickened, and I tried to steady my breathing. I peeked out the window, only to see the crowd of figures outside. But this time, something had changed. They weren't just standing still anymore. They were moving. Slowly, they advanced toward the door, each figure taking deliberate steps, their faces still obscured by the same blank masks. I backed away from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. What did they want? Why were they here? Suddenly, the door handle turned. A soft rattle, followed by the distinct sound of someone trying to force their way in. The figures outside were no longer motionless. They were trying to get inside. Fear seized me. I grabbed my phone, but my hands were shaking too much to dial. I knew I had to get out. This was no longer just a bizarre spectacle. It was a threat. They were trying to break in. I didn't waste another second. I ran through the back door, barely pausing to grab my jacket. As I sprinted down the alley behind my house, I heard footsteps following me. Slow, purposeful, but still distant enough to be out of reach for the moment. I didn't look back. I ran until my lungs burned, until I was far from the house and the masked figures. The streetlights blurred as I turned corners, seeking refuge in the nearest crowded area. I kept running, pushing my body to the limit. The adrenaline pumping through my veins kept me going, but my mind was racing in panic. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't go back to my house. I couldn't risk facing those figures again. I eventually found myself at a bus stop, alone in the quiet night. My breathing was erratic, but I couldn't stop. It felt like I was being hunted, the shadow of the masked crowd always looming in the back of my mind. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting them to be following me. The silence of the street felt oppressive, like the calm before a storm. I sat down on the bench, trying to calm myself, but the reality of what was happening kept crashing into my thoughts. I had to leave. I couldn't stay in the neighborhood anymore. These people, whoever they were, had crossed the line, and they weren't just standing outside anymore. They were trying to get in. What did they want? What would they do if they succeeded? I pulled out my phone, hands trembling, and scrolled through my contacts. I considered calling the police, but I hesitated. Could they help? Would they believe me? I couldn't even explain what had been happening without sounding insane. Instead, I called a friend, someone who lived in a different city, someone who wouldn't judge. They answered after a few rings. "Hey, it's me," I said, my voice strained. "I need your help. Can I come stay with you for a while? Something weird is happening, and I don't feel safe." There was a pause, and I could hear my friend's voice soften. "Of course, come right over. Are you okay?" I nodded, even though they couldn't see me. "I'll explain everything when I get there." I didn't wait another second. I stood up and started walking, my phone pressed to my ear as I gave my friend directions. I didn't care if it was far away. I just needed to leave. The figures, the silent watchers, the growing sense of dread, they had become an unbearable weight, and I couldn't live like this anymore. By the time I reached my friend's house, it was well past midnight. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I hadn't looked back since I'd left the bus stop, but I knew I couldn't relax until I was safely inside. My friend greeted me at the door, looking concerned but not pressing me for details just yet. "Are you okay?" they asked as I stepped inside. I nodded, but my eyes darted around nervously. The familiar comfort of my friend's home was welcome. It was late in the evening when I decided to take the shortcut home. I had been running errands all day, and I was tired, too tired to walk the usual route. I'd heard that the alleyways off the main street led through a quieter part of town, cutting through the traffic and noise, and bringing me to my doorstep faster. I wasn't familiar with the area, but it didn't seem too bad. The streets were quieter than usual, the kind of silence that made it feel like the world had faded away, leaving only shadows behind. The alley was narrow and poorly lit, but I shrugged off the discomfort. It wasn't that far, and I just wanted to get home. As I turned the corner, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was an odd tension in the air, but I ignored it, brushing it off as nothing more than my tired imagination playing tricks on me. I walked faster, but as I passed an old, seemingly abandoned building, I noticed a faint sound, muffled voices coming from the shadows behind the building. My footsteps faltered for just a moment, but I kept moving. That's when I saw them. A group of people, 4, maybe 5, stood in the shadow of the building, huddled together. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, facing the wall. Their silhouettes were sharp against the dim light from a nearby street lamp. I could just make out their faces, or rather, the lack of them. They were wearing masks, simple white ones, completely featureless, like the kind you might see in a play. I could feel my heart rate quicken, an instinctual warning firing off in my brain. But they weren't doing anything. They just stood there, unmoving. I took a deep breath and looked around, but there was no one else in sight. It felt off, but I tried to dismiss it. I kept walking, hoping they wouldn't notice me. The last thing I wanted was to get caught up in whatever strange thing they were doing. I thought about the figures a lot that night. When I got home, I locked the door, brushed off my unease, and tried to forget about the strange encounter. But the next evening, as I left the house again, I took the same shortcut, a little braver, still hoping it was just a random occurrence. And there they were again, this time more of them. It wasn't just a few people. It was closer to 10 or 12. They stood in the same spot, perfectly still, just like before, their white masks reflecting the dim light of the street lamps. I stopped in my tracks, my stomach sinking. The more I looked, the more the crowd seemed to grow, their figures starting to stretch down the alleyway, almost blocking my path. The weirdest part was that they didn't move, didn't speak, didn't acknowledge my presence. It was like they didn't even see me. I quickly turned around, walking briskly back the way I came, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When I glanced back, they hadn't shifted an inch. I couldn't explain it, but the sight of them sent chills up my spine. There was something unnatural about their stillness. That night, I stayed inside, careful not to peek out the windows. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see the images of the figures standing silently, waiting. For the next few days, the figures kept appearing. Every time I took the shortcut, they were there, sometimes more, sometimes fewer, but always standing in the same position. The air around them felt charged, as though they were waiting for something, waiting for me. Each time I'd hurry past, keeping my eyes forward, trying not to look directly at them. But the unease began to fester. There were whispers in the alley, low murmurs that I could barely hear over the rush of my heartbeat. I would glance over my shoulder, half expecting someone to be following me, but no one ever was. One evening I couldn't help myself. I watched them from a distance. I had to know what they were doing. I stayed hidden in the shadows of a nearby building, just barely able to see the figures gathered in the alley. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They just stood there, as if they were waiting for something or someone. But when one of them, someone who had always been at the back of the group, turned their head just slightly, my stomach churned. Their eyes were fixed on me, staring directly at the place where I was standing. My breath caught in my throat. They hadn't moved, hadn't acknowledged me before, but now they were watching me. I stepped back, heart pounding, and quickly turned to leave. But I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still watching me, following me with their unblinking eyes. That night, something changed. It was late, and I was finishing some work when I heard the soft sound of scratching at the door. I froze, my pulse racing. It wasn't a knock, but something quieter, more deliberate. My mind spun. Was it just my imagination? Had I heard it wrong? The sound came again, this time louder, more insistent. I stood up, heart pounding. It was coming from the back door, the one that opened into the alley. I moved cautiously, my hands trembling as I reached for the door handle, but when I touched it, it turned. The door wasn't locked. My blood ran cold. I stepped back quickly, unsure of what to do. I checked the windows. Nothing, no sign of movement. But then I heard something else, the unmistakable shuffle of footsteps outside. I backed away from the door, trying to be quiet, my breath shallow. And then I saw them. The masked figures were gathered at the edge of my yard, standing silently facing the house. The same eerie stillness. And then they started moving. One by one, they advanced, their footsteps slow but deliberate. My heart hammered in my chest. They weren't just watching anymore. They were coming for me. In a panic, I rushed to the back door, locking it just as the figures reached it. I could hear them rattling the handle, their movements becoming more purposeful, more aggressive. I needed to get out, but how? My mind raced, my heart pounding in my chest as I stared at the door. The figures were right outside, their attempts to break in relentless. I felt trapped. There was no escape out the front, and the back was now sealed. I needed to move, to do something, but my thoughts were a blur of panic. Suddenly, my eyes fell on the ground near the back door, the manhole cover. I had seen it before, forgotten about it in my panic, but now it was my only option. I rushed to it, my hands shaking as I tried to lift it. The cover was heavy, but I managed to slide it open, just enough to slip through. Without hesitation, I dropped down into the darkness below, pulling the cover back into place above me. I was in a sewer, a foul-smelling pitch-black tunnel, but at least I was out of sight. I didn't stop to think about how I ended up here or what dangers lurked in the dark. I just ran. I moved as quietly as I could, trying to stay low, my breathing loud in my ears as I forced myself forward. The sound of footsteps above me echoed down through the tunnels, distant but growing louder. The figures were still out there. My pulse quickened. Had they seen me escape? Were they following me? I stumbled in the darkness, scraping my hands against the cold, damp walls. The air was thick with the smell of decay, but I didn't care. All I could think of was the group above, moving closer. I had to get away. I found a narrow alcove deep in the sewer, tucked away from any potential line of sight. My breath was ragged, and I forced myself to remain still, my back pressed against the wall. The only sounds were the distant echo of my own breathing and the faint drip of water from the ceiling. I couldn't tell how much time passed. Minutes, hours. The longer I stayed there, the more my mind raced. I could still hear their footsteps above, muffled and distant, but I wasn't sure if they were looking for me or if they had moved on. I crouched down, trying to stay as small as possible, barely daring to breathe. The darkness felt suffocating, the silence deafening. The fear that I hadn't gotten far enough gnawed at me, but I knew that if I moved now, I might give myself away. My hands were clammy, my pulse still erratic, but I forced myself to focus. I had to wait. I had to be sure that I wasn't being followed. The only thing I could do was sit there and hope they'd give up. After what felt like an eternity, the sounds from above gradually faded, and the quiet seemed to stretch on forever. My mind kept playing tricks on me. Was that a sound? Was someone walking closer? I waited for a moment longer, then another. I strained my ears listening. The silence was finally absolute. I slowly and cautiously stood up, my legs stiff from crouching. My heart was still racing, but it was no longer the frantic, panicked pace it had been before. I moved through the sewer cautiously, trying to remember the route I had taken. The smell was overwhelming, but I pushed it aside, focusing on the path ahead. I didn't dare make any noise as I moved toward the manhole cover I had come through earlier. When I reached it, I paused, checking once more to make sure there were no footsteps nearby. After what felt like an eternity, I slid the cover back, pushing it open enough to peer through the small gap. I didn't see anyone. No figures stood waiting for me. The street was empty. It was late when I first heard it, the faint knock on the door. At first, I dismissed it as just the wind, or perhaps a neighbor playing a prank. I had been working late, finishing up some tasks at my desk when the sound interrupted the quiet. A quick, deliberate knock, 3 taps, each spaced apart just enough to make me pause. I rose from my chair and made my way to the door, my feet dragging slightly from exhaustion. But when I opened it, no one was there. The porch light cast long shadows on the ground, and the small yard beyond was eerily still. No footsteps, no movement, just the empty night. I stood there for a moment, puzzled. Maybe it was a mistake, I thought. Maybe someone knocked on the wrong door. I shrugged it off, heading back inside, and locked the door behind me. But as I sat down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It was probably just a prank, but the knock felt so deliberate. Almost as if someone knew exactly when I'd be at the door. I pushed it from my mind and tried to focus on my work, but the unease lingered. The next few nights, it happened again. Every time I'd be winding down my evening, preparing to get some rest, there'd be a knock on the door. Always the same. 3 short, precise knocks. The first time, I hesitated but figured it was just some kids messing around. The second time, I checked the peephole. No one. By the third night, I couldn't ignore it any longer. The knocking wasn't just random, it was persistent. It had a rhythm, a pattern. I found myself looking over my shoulder, wondering when it would come again. I checked the door, checked the locks, checked outside. Nothing. One night, I thought I heard it earlier, and I rushed to the door, hoping to catch whoever was responsible. But as I swung it open, I was greeted with only empty space. I stood in the doorway, scanning the yard and street, but saw nothing unusual. No one was there. The pattern was the same. Knock, check, no one. Knock, check, empty street. The repetition began to gnaw at me, but still, I couldn't understand why anyone would keep doing this. It didn't make sense. It was a few nights after that when the first note appeared. I was sitting in my living room, scrolling through my phone, when I heard the familiar knock at the door. It was late, after midnight, and I had already started locking up for the night. But I couldn't ignore it. Not anymore. I stood up and moved toward the door, expecting another empty doorstep. But this time, when I opened the door, something was different. A small slip of paper was resting on the welcome mat. I bent down and picked it up cautiously, unrolling it slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The note was simple, handwritten in neat black ink. "I'm watching you." I froze, my mind racing. Who could have left this? Why? It wasn't a prank anymore. This felt personal. My breath caught in my throat, and I looked around the empty yard, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck rise. It was late, and my mind quickly ran through possibilities. A neighbor's joke, someone playing on my paranoia. But the words, the simplicity of the message, sent a chill down my spine. Someone was watching me. I went inside, double-locked the door, and made sure the windows were secure. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The knocks continued, and the notes became more frequent. At first, they were sporadic, one every couple of nights. But soon, the knocking became almost nightly, always accompanied by a new message. "I know when you're home. I see you watching TV. You can't hide forever." Each message felt like a growing threat. The fear built steadily, like an invisible weight pressing down on my chest. I'd start to feel anxious every time the sun began to set, knowing that the knocking would follow soon after. The worst part was how close it felt, how personal it was. The messages weren't just random, they were things that no one should know. I had never mentioned to anyone that I watched TV in the evenings, or that I liked to stay up late. The things this person knew about my habits were too precise to be a coincidence. One evening, I decided to confront it. I waited by the door, determined to catch whoever was behind this, to face them and put an end to it. But when the knocking came, I didn't open the door. I waited, listening through the crack, expecting to hear footsteps, a rustle, anything. But nothing came. No movement, no sound of someone walking away. The fear was suffocating. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Someone had been watching me, and they were no longer content with just knocking on my door. They had a plan, one that was slowly unraveling before my eyes. The knocks were getting louder, more urgent. The notes had escalated too, each one darker, more direct, as though the person behind them knew exactly how to rattle me. One evening, after I'd settled into bed, I heard the familiar knock, 3 precise raps against my door. My heart dropped, and my hand trembled as I reached for the door handle. But this time, when I opened the door, there was no note waiting on the mat. Instead, someone had scratched a message into the door itself, carving deep grooves into the wood with something sharp. "I'll be inside soon." The words were jagged, uneven, as if they had been made in a hurry. I ran my fingers along the deep scratches, feeling the roughness of the wood beneath my fingertips. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead as I realized just how close the threat was now. This wasn't just some prank. Someone had been at my door. No note left this time, just the feeling of menace, like they were taunting me, making it clear that they could get to me whenever they wanted. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and triple-checked the windows. I couldn't ignore it anymore. This person wasn't just watching anymore. They were sending a clear message. They were getting closer. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind felt amplified in the silence. I kept the lights on in every room, hoping the shadows would stay at bay. But my mind raced with terrifying thoughts. What did this person want from me? Why couldn't they just leave me alone? I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stay here much longer. But the question was, where could I go? Who would believe that I was being tormented by some faceless person who seemed to know everything about me? As the knocks grew more frequent, I began to take desperate measures. I installed additional locks on the doors and windows, even though part of me knew it wouldn't make a difference. I wasn't sure if the intruder had access to a spare key, or if they had been sneaking in somehow, but the thought of being trapped in my own home terrified me. I decided to call a friend, someone I trusted, and explained as best as I could. I don't know what's happening, but something's wrong. I'm scared. This person, they're watching me. They're threatening me. But my friend wasn't sure how to respond. They told me it could be a prank or that I was overreacting. Maybe someone's just trying to mess with you, they said. Don't worry so much. I knew they meant well, but it wasn't just a joke anymore. I couldn't ignore what had been happening for weeks. I had tried to dismiss it, tried to explain it away, but now the situation was undeniable. The person behind the knocks wasn't just a random stranger. They had been watching me for far too long, and now the threats were getting more real. I took action. I called the police, though I knew deep down they'd think I was overreacting too. When they arrived, I explained the situation. The officer seemed skeptical at first, but promised to patrol the area for a while and check the neighborhood. I felt a slight sense of relief, knowing that someone else was aware of what was going on. But when the officer left, the knocking resumed, and the messages grew worse. It was a Friday night, and the knocking came again, this time louder, more insistent, as though the person outside was desperate to be heard. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I could hear scratching at the door, a frantic sort of energy behind it that made my skin crawl. I went to the door, but before I could even reach the handle, the note appeared again, slipped underneath the door, as if someone had been waiting for me to approach. I bent down to pick it up, my hands shaking. The message was different this time. It was simple, but chilling. You can't hide forever. You'll regret this. I didn't know who was behind this, and I didn't know how they had gotten so close, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't stay here anymore. The fear had grown too great, and I was no longer sure I was safe in my own home. The messages had escalated, and the threat felt real, too real. I didn't know what else to do. I called my friend again, my voice breaking as I explained that I couldn't stay in the house. I need to leave. I can't stay here. I don't know what to do. They agreed to help me, and I packed up the bare essentials, leaving behind everything I couldn't carry. I didn't even take the time to look at my house, the place that had once felt like home. All I could think about was getting out, getting as far away from whatever or whoever was tormenting me. As I pulled away from the house, I looked in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a shadow watching from the window. But there was nothing. The house sat in the dark, silent and empty. When I first pulled into Maplewood Heights, it felt like a dream realized. Rows of picturesque homes lined the streets, each boasting perfectly trimmed hedges and immaculate lawns. The neighborhood radiated calm, a stark contrast to the chaos of the city I had left behind. For someone like me, desperate for a fresh start, this place seemed like salvation. The moving truck had barely stopped when neighbors started appearing. A woman in her 60s, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a pastel dress, was the first to greet me. She handed over a welcome basket brimming with fresh bread, cookies, and even a small potted plant. Her name was Carol, and she introduced herself as the head of the Maplewood Neighborhood Association. "Welcome," she beamed. "We take pride in our little community here. You'll love it." Her words were warm, but her eyes lingered on me as if scanning for imperfections. Later that day, another neighbor, a man named Greg, helped me unload a few boxes. "We've got a tight-knit group here," he said casually. "You'll fit right in, as long as you follow the rules." He laughed, but there was something disquieting about how quickly his expression turned serious. That evening, I sat down to unpack the rule book Carol had left in my basket. It was thicker than I expected, almost like a small novel. Pages of regulations detailed everything from acceptable lawn heights to appropriate paint colors for doors. Even outdoor decorations had to be approved by the association. I brushed off the unease creeping in and told myself it was all part of maintaining a beautiful, harmonious neighborhood. By the time I went to bed, I was convinced I had made the right choice. The air was still, the streets were silent, and for the first time in years, I felt safe. The first few days in Maplewood Heights passed without incident. I followed the rules to the letter, mowed my lawn, greeted my neighbors, and attended the mandatory weekly meeting. At first, these rituals seemed harmless, even charming. But soon, I began noticing things that didn't sit right. During my morning walks, I would pass by empty houses with no signs of life. When I asked Carol about one in particular, she dismissed it with a smile. "Oh, the Parkers decided to move unexpectedly. It happens." Her tone left no room for further questioning, and I let it go. Then there was the time I overheard a hushed conversation between two neighbors. They spoke in clipped tones, glancing around nervously. I only caught fragments, something about violations and consequences. When they noticed me nearby, they abruptly changed the subject to gardening. The most unsettling moment came when I spotted a missing persons flyer pinned to a community board. It featured the face of a middle-aged man who looked vaguely familiar. I reached out to take a closer look, but before I could, someone snatched it away. "Old notice," they muttered, crumpling the paper and walking off. I tried to convince myself that I was overthinking things. Every community has its quirks, right? Yet, the more I tried to ignore the unease, the stronger it grew. I first felt the full weight of Maplewood's suffocating grip during the monthly meeting. Held in Carol's sprawling backyard, it was more formal than I had anticipated. Neighbors gathered in neat rows, their chairs forming a perfect semicircle. Carol stood at the center, clipboard in hand, overseeing the proceedings like a commander. About halfway through, she called out the name of Mr. Harmon, an elderly man who lived a few doors down from me. He shuffled forward, visibly trembling. Apparently his garden had become overgrown, a breach of the strict landscaping policy. Carol's voice was sickly sweet but firm. "Mr. Harmon, we've all noticed your neglect. It reflects poorly on the community." I'll fix it," he stammered, his eyes darting around for support that never came. Carol nodded curtly. "See that you do." The meeting continued as though nothing had happened, but I couldn't shake the image of Mr. Harmon's terrified face. I began to wonder what would happen if he didn't comply. Later, as the crowd dispersed, I tried to catch his eye, but he avoided me entirely. Around me, neighbors chatted and laughed as though they hadn't just witnessed a public humiliation. The first warning came after I forgot to bring in my trash bins within the designated hour. It was a simple mistake, but the next morning I found an official-looking letter on my doorstep. It was folded into thirds, sealed with the Maplewood Neighborhood Association emblem. The letter was concise. Failure to retrieve trash bins promptly is a violation of Section 5.2 of the Maplewood Code. Further infractions will result in corrective measures. I felt a chill reading the words. Corrective measures? I reminded myself it was just a formality, a way to maintain order. Still, the phrasing lingered in my mind, leaving an uneasy weight. Later that day, I found a handwritten note slipped under my door. The paper was thin, the ink slightly smeared. "Break the rules again, and you'll regret it." I stared at the note for what felt like hours. That night, I double-checked every lock and drew my curtains tight. When I peered out into the dark street, I thought I saw a figure standing under the street lamp, motionless, staring. But when I blinked, they were gone. A week passed, and life in Maplewood Heights fell into a strange rhythm. I followed the rules to the letter, careful not to repeat the mistake with the trash bins. The neighborhood seemed to settle around me, though the unease never truly left. Then one night, it all unraveled. I had always admired the bright blue house on the corner, home to the Ramirez family. Their children often played outside, their laughter echoing down the street. But one morning, as I walked past, I noticed something unusual. The curtains were drawn tightly shut, and the yard, once immaculate, had been left untended. No laughter, no signs of life. I asked Greg about it in passing. He hesitated before responding. The Ramirezes, they decided to leave. It's best not to dwell on it. His voice carried a strange edge, like a warning wrapped in casual indifference. When I pressed further, he waved me off and walked away. That night, I awoke to a strange noise outside, a low hum, like an engine idling. Peering through the curtains, I saw figures moving in the shadows near the Ramirez house. A group of them, dressed in dark clothing, carried large, indistinct objects to an unmarked van parked in the driveway. The van pulled away moments later, leaving no trace behind. The next day, the blue house looked as though it had never been lived in. A for sale sign was planted in the front yard, its presence as sudden as the family's disappearance. I couldn't ignore the growing dread anymore. I needed answers. Late one evening, when the streets were quiet, I decided to snoop around the community center. It was the hub of Maplewood Heights, where all records and meetings were kept. If there was a secret to uncover, I felt certain I'd find it there. Inside, the dimly lit space was eerily silent. Rows of filing cabinets lined the walls, each meticulously labeled. I searched through them, my hands trembling. Most files contained mundane details, maintenance schedules, meeting minutes, financial reports. But then I found a folder marked Corrections. Its contents were chilling. There were detailed reports of rule violations, along with names and dates. Next to many names were ominous stamps, removed. Among them, I recognized the Ramirezes, Mr. Harmon, and others I had noticed missing. Attached to each report were incident summaries written in detached clinical language. As I read, the door behind me creaked open. I froze, heart pounding, then quickly replaced the folder and slipped out the back door. I didn't dare look back. That night, I received another note. You're being watched. Stay in line. I knew I had to leave Maplewood Heights, but it wasn't as simple as packing a bag and driving away. The community's watchful eyes were everywhere. Every step out of line seemed to trigger a ripple of whispers and sidelong glances. Still, I began planning my escape in secret. I mapped out the quickest route out of the neighborhood and packed only the essentials. I avoided any behavior that might draw suspicion, acting as though I was content and compliant. But the pressure was suffocating. Every time I opened a curtain or stepped outside, I felt their eyes on me. The night before my planned departure, I heard footsteps outside my window. Peeking out, I saw shadows moving across the lawn. Someone knocked softly on my door, once, twice, then silence. My pulse thundered in my ears as I stayed perfectly still, waiting for the intruder to leave. When morning came, I found a fresh warning etched into the wood of my front door. You're next. I couldn't wait any longer. That night, under the cover of darkness, I grabbed my bag and slipped out the back door.